Fedorov, and I'm the cyber technical leader here at NFP, based in New York City. I'm very pleased to have Sean Curran, Keith Bergen, and Michael Picton from West Monroe here with us today. Keith, Michael, and Sean are going to talk to us about the do's and don'ts of ransomware, specifically what your company can do to limit the likelihood or impact of a ransomware event, best practices during an event and throughout the recovery process, as well as providing some best practices to maintain resiliency. Now, a bit about our speakers. Keith is the dedicated business development executive within West Monroe Partners cybersecurity consulting practice. A cyber risk transfer and mitigation expert, Keith has assisted organizations across all industry types throughout their risk-based decision processes nationwide. Keith's deep understanding of the insurance marketplace, cyber liability products, pre- and post-breach mitigation and remediation offerings, as well as the legal and regulatory landscape, allow him to partner with insurance organizations to ensure their clients and policyholders are educated and protected from cyber risk. Serving the legal and insurance communities for 15 years, Keith has held a variety of roles from multi-zone cyber liability practice leader at a global insurance brokerage to cyber liability claims manager at multiple carriers, to coverage and defense counsel in a national law practice. Keith is a frequent speaker on the topic of industry-specific organizational cyber risk, cyber trends, cyber liability coverage, and risk management. Keith earned his JD from Loyola University Chicago School of Law and his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Philosophy, minor in history from the City University of New York. A bit about Michael Picton. Michael understands that cyber attacks aren't a possibility, they are inevitable. He took a leap of faith to do something about it. He built a managed detection and response business from the ground up with services that have been employed by large commercial enterprises across the globe. After spending many years building and leading programs to protect and defend GE's intellectual property, he co-founded Morphic, recognized by Gartner as a pioneer and early leader in the MDR services market and ranked among the top firms to hold the NSA CIRA accreditation for incident response services. His firm became part of Booz Allen Hamilton in 2017. Now a partner with West Monroe's cybersecurity practice, he is a high-integrity, passionate leader and a team builder devoted to creating meaningful business and financial outcomes for employees, clients, business partners, and investors. Lastly, a bit about Sean Curran. Whether he is defining the strategy for an organization's preventative cybersecurity investment or leading an investigation into a breach or ransomware encryption case, Sean is committed to protecting his clients from all matters of cyber threats. Equally conversant with C-suite executives and technical teams, Sean's business consulting and deep IT infrastructure experience provide him with powerful insight into the cybersecurity risks, operational issues, and business impacts of information technology. Sean joined West Monroe from Protiviti, where he provided similar consulting services in both Australia and the United States. Previously, he held roles with National Australian Bank, Lucent Technologies, and several other technology-focused organizations. For those of you who may not know who West Monroe is, they are a national management and technology consulting firm with over 1,600 employees. The West Monroe cybersecurity practice was built from the ground up with a blending of deep technologists, but a focus on strategic security consulting. With this eye toward resilience, West Monroe was an original entrant into the incident response recovery space and has continued to expand its DFIR practice. The cybersecurity team also provides pre-breach and advisory services across a wide swath of industries with a heavy focus on private equity. West Monroe is also very well known as both a guided incident response and incident response readiness partner among all cyber liability insurance carriers in the market today. I personally have had the pleasure of working with West Monroe for a number of years and can speak to their responsiveness and effectiveness, again, on both the proactive side as well as the reactive side. Before we get started, just a quick note on logistics. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them as they become relevant throughout the presentation. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Keith, Michael, and Sean to get us started.
Yeah, so thanks very much. I appreciate that, and thanks for the introduction. Just to sort of kick off, let me sort of advance the screen a little bit here. So, probably no surprise to anyone on the call that ransomware is continuing to dominate the headlines across the board. What we're seeing in this day and age is not only an increase in the number of ransomware attacks, the advertisement and media coverage of those attacks, but also a shift towards sort of supply chain related incidents now as well. And we saw that at the beginning of this year with things like the Microsoft Exchange attack, late last year with SolarWinds and things of that nature, Kaseya earlier this year. So lots of different changes that are going on right now that the threat actors are starting to take advantage of. I think it's important for people to understand that ransomware attacks, as they continue to disrupt business, they've really shifted from or going through a bit of a shift right now. In the old days, it was mindless malware. It was the WannaCrys and the NotPetras of the world that with just a piece of malware that someone got and it encrypted the files locally on their machine. So home users were just as susceptible and at risk as those in business and corporate world. And nowadays, it's really shifted. The attacks are more hands to keyboard. They're being focused and approach, and the approach is actually taking a complete similar pattern across the board. So, that pattern typically starts with an initial compromise, what we call the access environment. And we're seeing groups spin up whose entire role within the attack is now just to provide that access, the access brokers. That initial compromise results in credential theft. Usually it's going to be administrative level accounts. From there, lateral movement around the environment, trying to get a sense of the size and scope of the network and what's available within that network to attack, where the backups might be that need to be deleted, where sensitive data might exist, can be exfiltrated, as well as just a sense, especially in a lot of organizations that may have gone through acquisition where there may be more than one network environment that needs to be attacked. The threat actors will start to map that out. They'll then typically try and build persistence in. We see that in the old days, it was Emotet and TrickBot as persistent mechanisms. More commonly today, it's Cobalt Strike. But even just creation of user accounts within Active Directory or VPN credentials that they can use to gain access back into the network. We're seeing a higher level of persistence being deployed by the threat actors. But data exfiltration has become common, especially in the last 12 to 18 months, really focused on trying to elicit payment in that extortion process, especially in the case where the victim may have backups that they can recover from. So the data exfiltration becomes the secondary extortion. And then obviously I mentioned earlier that backup deletion. One of the key methods of restoration for any business is going to be a reliance on their backups. And if the threat actor has the ability to delete those, obviously it encourages, or in some cases forces the victim to go through a process of obtaining the decryption key. And then obviously the last part of any attack is going to be encryption, right? It's the part where they're doing the last of what they need to do, and then they're out. One of the comments I'll make, though, is they're not always out. We are seeing increasingly some of the threat actors, through that persistence, maintaining access and monitoring what the client is doing in an attempt to try and either change the method of what's happening or to ensure payment. They may do other attacks during that process. There has been a little bit of a shift. We're not always seeing encryption. It's not always present in every attack. That file sort of exfiltration, the data exfiltration, is sometimes the only thing that's happening and really being used for extortion purposes. We see that in cases where there might be an EDR product that's going to alert the organization to the attack, or where they believe that the data is of really high value and that's all that they need to do. The other more troubling thing is what we're seeing in some of the encryption now is more than just file level encryption. So in the old days, all of the Word documents and Excel spreadsheets and even the databases, SQL databases that a company relies upon, would get encrypted as part of their process. More recently, what we're seeing is a shift towards what we call full disk encryption. Lots of organizations are using VMware as their virtualization stack, or they might be using Microsoft's Hyper-V to virtualize their hardware. Those basically create a virtual hard drive as a file, and the VMware instance or Hyper-V displays that out as the file system for the users. The threat actors have started to figure out that they can encrypt that VMDK, the virtual disk, or the hypervisor VHD file, and at that level, the entire server is completely inaccessible at that point. So it's not just the Word files or the Excel spreadsheets or the databases that are encrypted. We're seeing the entire hard drive being encrypted at that, which really has a major impact on the ability to perform forensics. The other one we just came across, I think we're working our first case on a Deep Blue Magic attack, which is a recent threat actor that really popped up, I think, in July of August of this year. And rather than just doing the VMDK level encryption, they're actually using some commercial disk level encryption tools to be able to attack organizations and encrypt the entire drive of the machine. So, this is a real shift from, standard file level encryption to disk level encryption, which really does have a significant impact on the methods that, the forensics teams will go about to try and recover the environment. When the entire disk is encrypted, including every single server in the environment, then recovery really gets slowed down. Not only is the recovery slowed down, but forensics are stuck. They can't do anything until they get access to a recovered or either a decrypted disk or a recovered backup. When you think about most networks, the reality of the environment is there's a couple of core components that generally, Active Directory for authentication. If the Active Directory domain controllers are encrypted, that is significantly going to impact the ability of forensics to the recovery team to start to get things back up and running. Those servers are typically also providing core services like name resolution, DNS. They're providing DHCP. All of those things will typically be out of action. And so the very first thing that needs to happen is recovery of core infrastructure services. And that can really slow down the process for anyone. Even if you've got viable backups, it's going to slow down the recovery process. And the other thing that's really important in ransomware cases is to note that while forensics is valuable, it's really there to tell you, what might have been the initial infection point. It's there to tell you whether or not you've got persistence within the environment that needs to be eradicated, so the containment side. And it's also there to tell you, whether or not you've had data exfiltrated and what that data might be. The challenge is it's going to take days, if not weeks, to get that information. In most cases that we see working with forensics providers, there is a huge lag between that process and realistically what the business cares about, which is minimizing the business interruption. When you think about ransomware attacks and a business being offline, that's the most visible thing that occurs to the outside world if the business services are no longer available. And so there needs to be a focus on that business recovery component. And that's what any person within the organization that's been impacted, the victim, is really caring about far more than they care about the forensic space. So it's important to understand that while forensics is going to take time to get to that root cause, the recovery team and the team that's helping to restore services really is best if it's augmented with a group that understands the different methods the threat actors use, understand the recovery playbook and how to contain the incident to avoid either reinfection or secondary attacks. When the internal IT team does it, they've typically had no experience at this. So they're going to make mistakes along the way and they're going to slow down the process or continue to rebuild an environment without understanding that the data that they're restoring from backup could include a component of the environment that contains persistence and allowing the threat actor to be back in. So a couple of quick questions just to answer. I saw in the question and answer, and just a quick note to anyone: if you do have questions, feel free. You should have a question and answer button down the bottom of the or at the top of the Zoom meeting. So feel free to click on those and add a question. Happy to answer those as we go along. But first one was, are there any threats being enacted upon individual personal computers? We still see some, what we consider the mindless worms, but typically threat actors aren't going after individuals, primarily because there's just not enough money in it. They're really looking for the big paydays. And so an individual typically isn't going to have the funds to pay for that, not to the level they want to be able to receive the funding from. So, I mentioned the access brokers before, the initial compromise piece. An access broker, someone who has access into a network, is typically a different group from those doing the infection. And that group is asking for funds to pay for that access. So the people doing the encryption are actually paying money first. So there's a certain amount of return on investment they're looking for based on how much they've paid for that access. The second question that was asked is, are large financial institutions being threatened? In terms of the risk here, we're seeing organizations of all size and scope being impacted by these types of attacks. The question for most is really how quickly they detect it and whether or not they're able to mitigate it. A lot of the big financial institutions, with the way they operate their networks and their environments, they've been dealing with this risk for a lot longer than smaller organizations or those in less regulated industries. And so they have a better ability to identify these types of attacks. Now, if you look at those big, large organizations, they can have a security team of 2,000 people. Take Chase for that, for example. 2,000 odd people responsible for security. That's far more than most of the other organizations you're dealing with. And so there's certainly a lower risk factor, but not completely removed out of there. In fact, the reason I got into security was working at one of the major banks in Australia when we were hit with a NIMDA virus that took out every single one of our ATMs and stopped operations for 2 or 3 days. So, this type of attack is not unusual, and we certainly have some of those challenges along the way. The other part of the risk that we saw, start to emerge in 2021 was really around supply chain risk. And I say emerge in 2021, but it really came to the forefront in 2021. But it's been around for years. Anyone who was involved or in the security industry back in 2013, when Target was compromised, that breach was famously perpetrated through the HVAC vendor. Target had a computer on their network that was connected to their domain that was providing monitoring of their heating, ventilation, and cooling systems. That attack, or the perpetrators of that attack, were actually able to compromise the HVAC vendor originally and gain access to passwords to the HVAC system within Target's network, and use that to then penetrate and access most of the other environments. So these types of attacks are not new. It's been around for some time. The Kaseya attack that occurred in June of this year was both a zero-day vulnerability and a supply chain attack. So they leveraged the Kaseya zero-day vulnerability that they had to be able to attack and deploy their ransomware across all of the customers of managed services providers that were using the Kaseya product to leverage or to manage their customers. We continue to see these types of attacks occur, and those sorts of things where it's a zero-day vulnerability, leveraging a supply chain attack like the Kaseya one, certainly one of the hardest ones to mitigate. Software isn't the only potential way for a supply chain attack to be perpetrated. There is an example more recent, going back probably about 3 or 4 years ago, of a hardware vendor that had a chipset within their hardware that had been compromised during the build process. So well before it was even soldered onto the motherboard of the server, and that hardware was being then put into Amazon AWS data centers. What they later found was that chipset had the ability to do remote command and control, and so it was a long slow attack process, allowing a nation state attacker to gain access into the very lowest end of the motherboard of a machine and start to take data. It's part of the reason why Huawei and companies like that are banned right now in the US, because of fears of that type of attack going on. So organizations need to be aware that supply chain risks aren't just going to be a software related risk, but software is obviously a much easier way for a perpetrator to gain access. And we're certainly going to see a rise in that now that the Kaseya attack has been so successful. Managed IT service, outsourced service providers like those that we use in Kaseya, this isn't the first time we've seen those being attacked either. At the beginning of 2020, we saw about 6 or 7 major MSSPs and MSPs being hit. Those managed service providers that are providing outsourced IT services for companies. And it was their own management tools that were being leveraged to deploy the software. Huge challenges there in the sense that the MSP is the person you trust. And if they're compromised, then it becomes very difficult for the end user of those services to be protected. Late in 2019, we also saw, I think it was the dental industry, where a number of the dental providers were leveraging the same supplier for their dentures, I think it was at the time. And that supplier had been compromised in a business email compromise, and that email account was being used to distribute the Emotet and TrickBot malware. So supply chain attacks are starting to be leveraged in multiple different ways, not just in the standard that you see with the Kaseya type attacks. What we're seeing now is that all the business to business type companies are going to see an impact of this. People are going to put higher scrutiny on their evaluation of those companies and how they consider them from a risk standpoint. Things like the external audits like SSAE 618, SOC 2s, the ISO 27001s, and things like that have often been leveraged by companies as proof that they've got good security controls, are no longer going to be valuable or as valuable as a reference of good security, given those types of attacks.
Yeah, and Sean, just to jump in here, as everybody looks at making a full risk management program for their organization, including the things that we're going to get into later around pre-breach mitigation tactics and hardening, also looking towards that risk transfer piece, or in other words, transferring any sort of risk of financial loss to an insurance carrier. One thing to keep in mind is that as the market hardens in cyber liability, carriers are starting to protect their books of business from this type of supply chain risk. So this is being led by one major carrier in the market, and all carriers are kind of discussing and coming up with verbiage around this, but they're making the distinction between limited events and widespread events. So something like Kaseya would be considered a widespread event. That's something that traditionally insurance carriers really couldn't underwrite to, but while the market was soft, they covered it. Now they're looking to protect their books and limit coverage in those aspects, forcing you as the policyholder, as the client, to take those mitigation steps and harden. So that's something that you want to keep in mind, that as if you're an organization that has a lot of third-party suppliers or third-party companies that you work with to maintain your business, you're going to need to take additional steps outside of insurance to ensure that you mitigate your risk.
All right, this is Michael Picton. I'm going to talk here for a minute about some of the do's and don'ts during an incident, and looking at, from a forensics perspective, when you come into an incident, I mean, there's really 3 key objectives. One is to understand, if there is any persistence in the environment, to find that and contain it, so it does not spread. Figure out then how they got in. And then ultimately, if there's any data exfiltration, understanding the risk there. But early on in an investigation, before you get help and bring in forensics firms and everybody else, There's often some mistakes that are made that just folks don't know one way or the other. They bias to action and start moving quickly, and ultimately may end up stomping on some critical evidence or forensics that are needed. So that's where this is really focused on. Some of these things are, around the tendency to go shut systems down and take them off the network. Those are two different things. We want to take them off the network if we know that they're encrypted. So that way, any infection on that system, they cannot propagate or push to other systems on the network. But we do not want to shut it down and like power off the system because the memory, a lot of these attackers are resident in memory. They're not on disk. So if you reboot or shut down a system and power it off, all that forensics evidence of what was there is now lost. So it's absolutely key to take things off the network if you can, disable the NIC. Get it off the network so it cannot propagate and they cannot maintain that command and control, but certainly try to keep the system up so you can preserve that evidence. A couple other things, I think around getting some of the collection and memory dumps. I mean, oftentimes, whether it's your VPN concentrators or network firewalls, things like that, those logs tend to rotate very quickly. So as soon as, and they're usually very noisy logs. So as soon as something has happened, having the teams go and preserve those logs, get them exported to disk if you don't have them centrally, managed through like a SIM or something like that. Try to pull those logs off because there is often some critical clues into how they may have gotten in those logs. So I'm kind of covering some of the do's and the don'ts as we walk through this, is counter to each other. Overall, though, I think one of the things that I'm going to traverse to the next slide as far as looking at the roles and responsibilities in these incidents. Forensics is one very big piece of it, but recovery and what ultimately clients ultimately care about in these situations is, I just want to get back to my business. I want to get back to restoring the business, getting business operations, getting revenue and everything running again. The forensics traditionally has been, come in and rope off the crime scene, wait to do anything until we know exactly what's going on. What we're really seeing now is the need to really integrate the forensics and the recovery capability. It's not rope off the crime scene, wait for recovery until we have everything figured out from a forensics perspective. We've got to work in parallel. Having that integrated forensics and recovery capability working together, and you get a much better, speed to outcome and a much better, more efficient execution of the objectives if you have, both teams working together. And if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide here, talk through some of the visual here. So I just talked about some of the screening off of, you see recovery on the right-hand side of this here, and we're really beginning to flip the script on this because we found that in many incidents we'll come in and there's a recovery team. It may be sometimes there's different vendors than the forensics team, and you end up running into some inefficiencies there where the right hand's not talking to the left hand. Oftentimes on recovery, the forensics teams are actually relying on the technologists on the recovery side to come in and help with things like collection and deploying some of the EDR tools and things that are needed to help with containment and the investigation. So the forensics folks are waiting on the recovery folks, but the recovery folks are also waiting on the forensics folks, and you end up losing a lot of efficiencies there. So as we're changing this model where you have an integrated crisis management, forensics, and remediation recovery team working together, in parallel to stand up that isolated environment to start rebuilding while you're collecting and feeding the forensics information back to the forensics team, and having an integrated loop and communication between those teams. So that way everyone's marching forward to understanding what happened, containing the persistence, and recovering the business, in parallel. And as we've looked at this, and the more that you do integrate those, we're seeing it's a benefit to all. Given the clients get speed to the outcome is much better overall from a carrier perspective. There's less loss. There's less cost in the actual incident itself if these functions are all working together in parallel. See, we've question, yes, as far as the slides, I think the question that just came into the Q&A, these will be provided afterwards, I assume. I think the answer to that is yes. So as we look ahead, and I'll flip back to Sean here as far as planning, what can you do ahead of time and planning for an incident, and really practicing resiliency up front. Some of the things that we typically see is everyone feels like they've got good backups, and you really don't know until you need to restore. Practice resiliency, practice recovering your systems, the full systems, not just a file here or there. And here, I'm gonna hand it off to you, Sean, and walk through some of this here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Michael. So, one of the things we continue to see or tell people is, expect the unexpected. 0-day attack vulnerabilities, they can't be patched. If everyone was aware of the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability in January of this year, a lot of the attacks we're seeing today right now are being perpetrated through things like the Pulse VPN or the SonicWall VPN vulnerabilities that are often identified after an attack has already gone through. So, despite all of the protections that someone might put in place and all of the controls that they may have, those 0-day vulnerabilities that exist within software can result in the method of attack. So even though you're fully prepared, you might be patching your systems on a regular basis and following all the right guidance. You might be doing vulnerability scanning and penetration testing to identify any of those known vulnerabilities that could be exploited or configuration gaps. The 0 days can't be patched and therefore continue to be a risk to organizations. So even the best controls can result in an attack. Deploying MFA on the cloud is extremely important. Cloud VPN, remote management, remote access tools and deploying it for everyone. I think a lot of organizations are starting to deploy MFA in their M365 environments. The impact of that is pretty minimal for most users. They're starting to get used to it. Most people have probably been dealing with multi-factor authentication for banking for some time. But where people forget is what we consider to be the control planes, the remote management systems and tools that may be used by IT to provide support, the remote access tools that may exist for deploying software, even the cloud-based service providers like Azure and AWS, the control plane of that gives access into how you manage and operationalize those tools. All of those require multi-factor authentication to protect against attacks. On the backup side of things, it's an interesting situation that we continuously see. The challenge with backups is the size and scope of data that to be backed up. We often deal with companies that have in excess of 10 terabytes of data that they're backing up on a regular basis. For most organizations, that size of data set is going to take days, if not weeks, to get back out of the cloud. So while it's good practice to have what we consider to be offsite storage of backups, having the backups available locally to the environment in a method that is what we call immutable, so a storage that can't be deleted, is extremely important, because the bandwidth necessary to restore all of that data in the event of an encryption like a ransomware attack is just nowhere near what the organization is going to be willing to pay for. The other part of that is making sure that the backups are complete, a full system image, especially as we start to see the VMware type of attacks or the full disk encryption attacks. The operating system is no longer there. So if the company has to go through the process of building the server, hoping they still have the software and configuration information for the application that runs on that server, and then restore the data after that, it's going to elongate the process to recovery. So having a full disk image is going to allow them to just restore the entire server at once. It sounds basic, but for many organizations to try and minimize their footprint of data being backed up, they'll only back up the data set and they'll ignore the system configuration because they assume they can build that server from scratch. And that assumption is challenging. Understanding that entire recovery process is important. A lot of organizations will create what we call the RTO and RPO, the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. A recovery point objective is how long or how much data can you afford to lose? Is it 24 hours or 2 hours? And that determines how often you perform a backup. So if I can, if you're thinking about banking services, for instance, they can't afford to lose any data. In that real-time system, if you were to lose a transaction, you're losing details about money transfers between accounts. You're losing details about how much is in a person's bank account. They can't afford to have that, so they are replicating that data on a regular basis. For other organizations, the loss of a day's data may be acceptable, or for 2 hours of data may be acceptable, and that's their recovery point objective. The recovery time objective is how quickly they can recover. And that's the one that most people make a mistake around. They look at it as an independent system by system analysis. It's going to take me 2 hours to restore server X. That may be 100% correct. But if you've got 50 server X's and each one takes 2 hours to restore, is it really 2 hours or is it 100 hours? And a lot of that depends on the hardware you have in the back end, the speed of the disk writing that backup file, the network bandwidth that exists. All of those things impact the recovery time objective. It's not just the restoration of multiple servers at once. And so we often see organizations who have underestimated their bandwidth availability. They've underestimated their disk read-write speeds, or they've underestimated the amount of memory and time and effort it takes to recover a system. So where they think they've got a 2 hour or 4 hour recovery window ends up being days, weeks, or even months. I mentioned the network bandwidth side or offsite bandwidth. We were dealing with a hospital system that was hit with ransomware a couple of months ago. They had 70 terabytes of data up in the cloud that they needed to recover. It was all 100% available, and we're able to confirm the restoration of that. The problem for us was going to be that to get that data out of the cloud was going to take in excess of 20 days. That's 20 days the entire hospital system is going to be down for while we recovered that data out of the cloud. Worse still was the fact that not only was it going to take us 20 days to get the data down, but they had a process in place to delete their backups after 7 days. So when you start to do the math, you're not going to have the data there in 7 days. And we weren't aware of that deletion process. And they'd forgotten about the fact that they were deleting on 7 days. So as we started to do the math and work it out, we actually quickly got to a point where we were starting to lose backup integrity and backup data. And so we had to stop the process of backup deletion. So these are the types of things that most of their on-site team had never dealt with. And it's only because of our experience in dealing with other organizations that we know to ask, when do your backups get deleted? How much data do you have in the cloud? What's your bandwidth in and out of your data center? Is there other ways we can get the data out? Does your provider provide a hard drive? Would they ship us a hard drive? Can we get a bigger data pipe into your network in a short period of time to be able to give us the bandwidth we need? Or in some cases, we see organizations having to pay the threat actors for the recovery key, just because that is going to be the quicker way to recover the environment. It's an important factor when considering this.
Sean, one of the questions that just came up from Pat was, depending on the organization, the cost of downtime seems to be more costly than the ransom itself, as you're saying. So what's the best practice to ensure the speed of data recovery once encryption keys have been provided? And I'd add to that, if you can, don't, let's not rely on the ransom keys, because that's certainly a last resort. It's not always reliable. I think one of the things that we found in some of these restorations where they have gone down that path, perhaps in parallel with restoration, they're also going to go down the path of decryption with the keys, and play both, hoping that one of them gets there faster than the other. But the actual decryption process, once you get those keys, is not a sure thing with these threat actors. They invest their time up front to get into these environments, to find, to do the reconnaissance, get into these environments, and get your money. Once they have that and they give you those keys, they have not spent a ton of investment on building really good decryption tools. So the decryptor that they often provide is imperfect. It's not fully tested, and it's oftentimes it's not going to be doing error correction and doing a full encryption of every file. It skips things, and it's not always good. So there's certainly some lack of reliability on that path. But if that is your only path, some of the recommendations, one is certainly work with some of the reputable firms around the negotiation process for getting those keys, and working with the threat actors. Do not go it alone. There's a lot of intelligence and knowledge that's been learned in the process of doing this, and they also understand a lot of these decryptors. So some of these providers, most of them have some of their decryptors themselves that they've built that are a lot more reliable than some of these global decryptors that they have are a lot more reliable than the decryptors that the threat actors provide. So you have a much better chance at that point using one of those decryptors than you would one of the ones that's provided, because you can use it. They're programmable. You can actually use them to deploy on a broader scale than what some of these threat actors will provide you.
Yeah, great point, Michael. And we've seen that. We had a client that was hit with ransomware. They had 700 brick and mortar locations that were impacted by it. The tool that we got from the threat actor in this particular case, because the backups had been deleted, the tool we got from the threat actor couldn't be scripted. So we literally had to build a team of people whose entire job it was to log onto every single server and to run the decryption process, validate what was missed, as Michael mentioned, the missed files, and start to reattempt those encryptions. The other big piece we often see here as well is the fact that the tools themselves, or the threat actors, when they're encrypting, they're not always shutting down services cleanly. And so you can end up with databases, especially those that have log files and things like that, where the log file might be encrypted at a different time as the database itself. And so as a result, what we get is a corruption of the database that either takes a long time to try and figure out, or just makes it completely unusable. So it's not, and I've seen this before, do the threat actors often give you the decryption key if you pay? We rarely see a threat actor not provide that, although with REvil recently in their shutdown, we did see some, I think it was 2 instances where the groups affiliated with REvil that got back in touch with their victims and said, hey, even though REvil's out of action, we're the group that has the keys, we can give it to you. In 2 occasions, they did not provide us with anything after the payment was made. And we think some mistakes were made along the way in terms of, gaining validation that the threat actor that the victim was talking to was the same threat actor. But in most cases they do. But the problem isn't the lack of keys. The problem is often the data doesn't always come back the way you expect, and so that can cause some challenges. And we've seen some organisations impacted by that. Some of the don'ts around this is don't assume that the attack will be minimal. All systems are typically impacted here. We see very rarely do we see organizations where there's minimal impact, 2 or 3 systems, unless they caught it quickly, or they had an EDR tool in there that was able to stop the attack. Most cases, the way they've scripted it is it's all happening at once. And so, there's a very large number of systems, typically only network connected systems, depending on how the malware is distributed or the encryption process is distributed, it's typically only those that were connected to the network at the time. But with some of those attacks, like the Kaseya attack, where they're using the RMM tool to do this, those types of places is where we'll see, remote workstations still impacted as well. The one I often say when we get on the phone with a client for the first time is, look, this is a marathon. The first couple of days are going to be run at sprint pace, right? It's not going to be a short process. So if anyone's expecting this to be done in 2 or 3 hours or 2 or 3 days, they're just going to be disappointed. And so I think that's one of the messages that need to be provided to the executive team pretty early on in the process. This is going to take some time, and they need to be aware of that impact. And they need to start preparing for at least a week of outage, if not 2. On average, recovery takes a normal organization doing it on their own. Recovery takes them three plus weeks. On average, when we're involved, we can get it done in a week and a half. And so we're typically able to bring back most what we consider critical operations, and for us, critical operations are revenue generating operations, those that are going to have the biggest impact on revenue generating services. We can typically get those back in a couple of days once we've got the infrastructure back up and running. But it's important to recognize that this is a process, and that they're going to be going through that for some time afterwards. There's going to be those 2 or 3 boxes that are less valuable, that are going to take some time that are going to be at the end of the process to get recovered. And so 80-20 rule in terms of recovery. Most systems and environments, 80% of them are recovered within sort of that 2 to 3 week range. One of the things that is important to note, or what we see prologuing recovery, technical debt. Organizations that have outdated, unsupported software and hardware, that's where we see a huge issue. A good example of that, we had a recovery process going on, and the disk storage system that they had that had all of the encrypted data on it was running on old hardware, and that hardware required a USB 2 connection was all we could connect onto it. USB 2 speeds are really slow, and so trying to pull data off that hardware at the time was just going to take us days or weeks. Unknown malware persistence is going to slow things down as well, right? When the organization doesn't know where the malware is or the persistence, it's going to be impactful, and it's going to slow down the process. Infrastructure sprawl is another good one. We see that quite often, where the infrastructure is across the environment and put into different locations, where there's decentralized infrastructure management. All of those things impact the speed to recover. Custom developed applications and things of that nature are also going to slow down the process. Michael?
Yeah, so Sean, this is Keith. One thing that I can add here is, you have to be concerned not only about your business operations being down, but you also need to be cognizant about the regulatory environment and also the potential for third-party lawsuits. One of the things that we're seeing, and in about the last year and a half, we've seen 3 separate U.S. court districts, Virginia, District of Columbia, and Pennsylvania, basically defeat privilege. And what those cases, the impact of those cases are, if you do have third-party litigation that comes out of any sort of cyber incident, your forensic report can, if it doesn't meet a certain set of guidelines, if it's not fully protected by the work product doctrine. That's not going to be shielded in discovery. So, one of the things to be aware of is, if you keep moving forward with your IT environment, with your infrastructure, and you can demonstrate that you do have a plan, that the boardroom's taking it seriously, that you're making the investment, that's going to help both if you do get sued in the event of a breach, and also with regulators. So, as these reports, what they're oftentimes going to find is that maybe you knew about a flaw in your infrastructure for years, and you just made no investments towards it. So those are the things that you really want to try to avoid, and you want to just keep showing that the ball's moving forward. So with that, I'll kick it over to Michael. He'll show you some proactive steps and some that may not even require monetary investment.
Thanks. Yeah. So when we get into a lot of these, oftentimes the capability was there and it had just not been configured or enabled fully, and it's oftentimes a very quick configuration change or fix that could have gone a long way in mitigating, either decreasing the likelihood or decreasing the impact of the event when it happened. So a couple of these we'll walk through. One, the spam and phishing platform. Making sure that a lot of the initial attack vectors come in through email, somebody clicking a link and opening up access to the outside world. There's a lot of ways to prevent things right there, and that also does include education to your users. They're oftentimes the last line of defense. Having them, phishing aware and understanding not to click on bad links. Don't click is a good motto as far as if you're not sure who it's coming from or where it's going. Oftentimes that can be a strong last line of defense. The admin credentials. So oftentimes we saw one just last week where there was a number of global administrator accounts that were no longer being used in an environment, in their AD environment, in their M365 environment, that had been set up one time for a vendor or a specific software provider to come in and do their installation and setup. But those had never been disabled downstream, and it was those accounts that were never used and forgotten about that were initially compromised in the attack. So just take an inventory, reduce the number of global administrative accounts, separate those, the use of those accounts from individual accounts. So make sure your sysadmins are only escalating to those privileges when they need to do global administrative tasks, and then de-escalating and using their normal account for normal operations. RDP. So RDP is protocol for remote desktop. This is very commonly open. It's convenient for administration and remote administration in an environment. It's also very convenient for attackers to leverage to get in from the outside. There's a number of exploits that start with companies still having RDP open to the internet. That should be shut down and very much limit use of RDP in your environment as much as possible. Local administrative passwords. I think the other one around MFA is a big one. MFA could be enabled and should be enabled for all users. I think most of us now are used to that in our personal lives. Whether it's your banking or even personal email at Gmail and things, you can enable two-factor. And I think it's more accepted now. It's less of a inconvenience for folks now that it's a part of everyday life. Get it enabled across the board. It definitely goes a long way for credential compromise. And then on the proactive side, really threat hunting is assuming that there may be a compromise in the environment and doing proactive analysis of the environment, be it your business email systems, your endpoints, leveraging an EDR beyond just traditional antivirus or in like a Windows Defender, using an EDR that's actually doing that has threat hunting capability, can look at persistence factors and also contain those in real time. Those are some tools that can absolutely help limit the likelihood and the impact. As far as the impact goes, I think we hit a lot of these, as we walk through some of the stories, Sean and I, the backups, having good backups and actually practicing recovery. Many years ago, it was looking at disaster recovery, and if a hurricane hits one of our data centers, how are we going to rebuild it? The ransomware is the new hurricane in that that example is that's really what's happening in practicing that recovery. Not just the file-based recovery of a single backup, as making sure you can actually recover the systems. You've got the business processes that need to be recovered and mapped back to the dependencies of the infrastructure, and understand your recovery capabilities up front will help you go a long way to minimizing that impact downstream. Network segmentation. So if you have some web-facing applications, have those isolated and contained in a DMZ with limited access back into the production environment. Have segregation within your network so that if one area is compromised, it's not going to easily be propagated or affected in another area. AD hygiene. There's a number of settings that you can put in place for global password changes on a regular basis, password complexities, and practices for joining and leaving users. Making sure you maintain good governance around the accounts and Active Directory and some of the settings there. Couple of the few at the end I'll hit on that don't you really don't require a lot of insurances or a lot of investment is the law, the insurance, and the partners that you have. I mean, oftentimes we'll get into this into these incidents, and you end up wasting a lot of time trying to bring the key third parties to the table that are needed, whether you've got an IT service provider, an MSP, or whatever that is. When you are practicing resiliency and practicing and doing like a tabletop exercise or even practicing recovery, make sure to include those key, identify who those key third parties are and include them in the plan. And that's, within your organization, general counsel, public relations, understanding your insurance and your legal, ties when you have an incident and the order in which you want to engage those. And then your IT service provider partners that are going to be key to restoration and recovery. Because oftentimes, those are some of the things that are missed during those exercises and can go a long way in actually speeding up your outcome. Any further questions? I think we're about 3 minutes up against time here. I guess we could open it up now for any questions on the call or on the chat. That said, we thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say there was one last question that was from earlier, and forgive me if you did answer it and I missed it. Are the threats being enacted upon individual personal computers? And I can answer that one. And or are large financial institutions being threatened? So the answer, I think, is both. But obviously, we're seeing much more against larger institutions and especially FIs and those in the more heavily regulated space that just tend to have more of a dearth of data. But if you guys want to just add something quickly there, and then I'll wrap it up for us.
Yeah, certainly. I think to your point, right? Occasionally you'll see an individual computer that's still not Petra and WannaCry running around the internet at times, but it's rare. We probably see more what we consider to be crypto mining types of attacks, where the residual CPU cycles are being used to mine cryptocurrencies. We see those types of attacks on individual computers more than anything else. And the large financial institutions always have a potential risk here, no matter which way you look at it. But generally, because of the capabilities they have in their security teams, that they're less at risk than those smaller organizations.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Keith, Michael, and Sean, for all of that really informative information. Certainly, really helpful. As I mentioned earlier, for everybody on the call, West Monroe is a trusted partner for NFP and can be an invaluable resource in helping your organization prepare for and quickly remediate and recover from a cybersecurity incident or more specifically ransomware. If you're interested in learning more about how West Monroe can help your business prepare for and respond to a cybersecurity incident, please reach out to myself, your local NFP broker, or West Monroe directly. With that said, I want to close it out. Thank everybody for your time today and let you know that a recording of today's presentation will be available in 48 hours. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks so much to West Monroe, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.